everything that China has been doing geostrategically over the last decade as an attempt to break out of this encirclement westward through the Belt and Road Initiative. Most importantly, its sidearm, its side street in Pakistan. What the US and China need to learn is what the US and the Soviet Union have learned in the last Cold War, is to understand very clearly the red lines of the other and start to communicate. Both the hardware as well as the software of high tech is no longer compatible in the world of tomorrow, and countries will have to choose between one world or the other world.
Hello and welcome to InferTalks, a podcast where I put you in the room with some of the biggest thought leaders from around the world. Joining me today for a conversation is Marc Saxer, a German political analyst and strategist. For over a decade in Asia, he has supported progressive and democratic initiatives in the continent. After his return to Berlin, he contributes to programmatic development of the Social Democratic Party. He is the author of the book Transformative Realism: How to Overcome the Systemic Crisis. Mr. Saxer will speak on geopolitical tensions and geoeconomic disruptions and how they will lay the foundation for a new world order. Mr. Saxer, welcome to InferTalks.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Marc, let's go ahead and start our conversation. And the very first question that I want to ask you is basically about you having an unorthodox view of this whole situation, or the fear of a showdown between US and China. Let me ask you, how different is your view from the predominant view that actually exists on US-China contest?
Well, it depends on what you define as the predominant view. My inkling would be that there is a view, of course, that a hot conflict between the US and China is more or less inevitable. You can say I differ from that. I do believe that we live in an age of uncertainty, that we see the old order coming to an end, but we do not know exactly how the future will unfold. Even next year and then a year after that is quite uncertain. So I think at this particular point in history, at this juncture in history, all we can do is speculate. And maybe that would be a nice thing to do with you in this few minutes that we have together. From my point of view, I see four basic scenarios that could unfold in the next decade or maybe 2 decades. Number one is indeed a hot war between the US and China, most likely over Taiwan, that could easily spiral out of control. And I think we're going to dive into that in a minute. The second scenario would be a Cold War, so no hot fighting, but basically bipolarity in the international order and the alliance systems, technological bifurcation, an ideological binary between democracy and autocracy, and trade bloc building with proxy wars. The third scenario would be strategic management of the strategic competition, something that we saw in the last Cold War in the latter half, so to say, though this is about exclusive zones of influence. This is about backroom deals. This is about informal governance. And finally, I could see the possibility of a compromise, of a deal. You may call it a détente, also something that we saw in the latter half of the old Cold War that would allow some sort of limited cooperation between the rivals.
But Marc, speaking of the hot contest that you actually allude to, and this is primarily about, a conflict over Taiwan between US and China, how serious is the risk of a conflict breaking out on it?
I think it is very high stakes, but maybe low probability. And let me explain why I believe that. First of all, why is it such high stakes? And we're talking basically about the probability of a war between the US and China around Taiwan. So you look at the basic geopolitical constellation in the Indo-Pacific, both from the perspective of Beijing and the perspective of Washington, you will see it's quite different. From the perspective of Beijing, China feels encircled by the US and its alliance system. it feels threatened by the first and second island chains, which is basically a series of military installations in the Western Pacific. And it especially feels worried that the US and its ally can cut off its supply lines and trade routes in the Malacca Strait. So you could basically interpret everything that China has been doing geostrategically over the last decade as an attempt to break out of this encirclement westward through the Belt and Road Initiative. Most importantly, its sidearm, its side street in Pakistan, the CPEC, which allows China to bypass the Strait of Malacca and access the Persian Gulf directly, and eastward through an exercise of militarization of the South China Sea, where it gets in lots of conflicts with its neighbor, and a strategic push into the strategic depth of the Pacific. So if you look at the very same situation from the perspective of the United States, then China is the first aggressive military peer since Pearl Harbor that pushes into the Western Pacific and therefore threatens Guam, threatens Hawaii, and threatens the US West Coast. So for both sides, this is a security risk and a national security interest of the highest level. And therefore, if a conflict starts, most probably around Taiwan, it will be extremely difficult to contain it. Still, I'm not convinced that this is high probability. Why? I do believe that it is just not in the interest of China to seek a direct confrontation with the biggest military power in the world. Actually, China all it needs to do is to lean back while the US is being dragged into one military and security quagmire after the other. We do have an ongoing hot war in Ukraine. We do have a danger of escalation of the Middle East. We do have tensions on the Balkans and on the Korean Peninsula and so on. So China basically also needs to lean back, let the US exhaust itself in all these foreign quagmires and keep it away from pivoting to Asia. So high probability, high stakes, but low probability, I would say.
And, speaking of the possibility of a detente, let me bring your attention to, how we've seen conversations progress over, last few months when, there was no definitive progress in terms of resumption of military talks between the US and China. What kind of understanding do you foresee taking place between these two countries now that President Joe Biden and President Xi have also met and have at least agreed to, bring about some thawing of ice in this particular area?
First of all, I think it's a good thing the two met at the sidelines of the APEC meeting in San Francisco. I think it's always good to have direct channels of communication. I think some outcomes were put on the table. You have now direct channels of communication between the militaries because you can never exclude that a conflict actually flares up through accident. There is a lot of action in the Taiwan Strait and something bad could happen. So these kind of direct channels of communications are important. Beyond that, unfortunately, the conflict or the, let's say, different schools of thought over the future of Taiwan for 7 decades have been managed what you call strategic ambiguity. And unfortunately, this strategic ambiguity has been shattered from both sides. So it's now a little bit difficult to get the genie back into the bottle. So I think going forward, what the US and China need to learn is what the US and the Soviet Union have learned in the last Cold War is to understand very clearly the red lines of the other and start to communicate so not in order not to accidentally cross it.
And so if I may try and, pick your brains further into this, what kind of understanding or what 2 to 3 areas where you think, in this very domain, some understanding might have to be reached by both sides?
Well, a resolution of the conflict, I think, is quite difficult. I mean, the basic ingredients are, of course, on the table. That is still the one China policy that the US adheres to. So in principle, I think there is no conflict. The problem is obviously the mistrust between the two sides, that one side may do something that the other side may see as a provocation and crossing the line. So for the US, that would be, of course, reunification by force, and for China, it would be a nuclearization of the Taiwan island and direct military aid. So I think the red lines become clearer, and in the absence of a clear political resolution, that may be a good step forward.
And going forward, speaking of the US-China contest, what areas do you really see, apart from the military domain, where you possibly see that contestation becoming more intense?
So let's assume cooler head prevails, and there's not going to be a hot war between the US and China. Then we're going probably into something of a mix between a Cold War, all-out Cold War, or a strategic competition which can be managed. The interesting thing is different from the old historical Cold War. This is an area contestation which is mainly in the fields of economics and technology. So we basically see a couple of trends happening over the last couple of years. We see the politicization of market access, both in the US as well as China. We see a reorganization of global supply lines, the whole nearshoring, reshoring, as well as friendshoring discourse that we hear about. We see technological bifurcation, the possibility that both the hardware as well as the software of high tech is no longer compatible in the world of tomorrow, and countries will have to choose between one world or the other world. We see currency wars around the reserve status of the US dollar. De-dollarization is the catchword there. We see, of course, an acceleration of digital automation and the use of AI. So a lot of things are actually happening in the fields of economics as well as technology. And I believe that that is going to be the biggest impact of the world in the next decade.
Speaking of the competition in the domain of tech, energy, and finance, how do you think, this contestation is likely to affect the emergence of a new political or an economic global order?
Well, I think this is exactly what we're witnessing. I think it's fair enough to say that the age of the neoliberal phase of globalization is over. I do not go as far as calling the next phase deglobalization. I think there is still a lot of interdependence in the world, and that's a good thing. But this idea that you can organize the world economy around the principles of cost efficiency and a market-driven globalization, I think that's over. And it's over because both the US and China, as well as other blocs, are actually shifting to a new economic paradigm. In China, of course, you witness the emergence of the dual circulation economy, which means that China is weaning itself off from its depending on export, and is basically trying to get greater emphasis on the domestic market, domestic demand. And if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act that the Biden administration has passed, or Bidenomics in general, which is high emphasis of the role of the state when it comes to export controls and investment screening, when it comes to industrial policy, all of that has little to do with the neoliberal paradigm we saw over the last 40 years. So we are indeed at the start of a new world economy. We just don't know how the next one's going to look like.
And so, speaking of, emerging economies or middle power countries, including countries like Pakistan, how do you think they're likely to tap into economic opportunities that might be created as a result of it? And if I may also ask, what will the reconfiguration of economic order look like to you when you speak of the continent of Asia itself?
Well, as any change in history always brings risk and opportunities. The opportunities for a country like Pakistan are obviously called China plus one. So if Western countries or the West and its allies are reconfiguring their supply lines, are basically redirecting their investment. I'm not talking about decoupling. I'm talking about diversification here. Of course, some countries are going to benefit. And you can already see that. I think right now, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and India are in a pole position to benefit from these reconfigurations, but Pakistan could be one of them. When we talk about risk, we have to be a little bit more fundamental, because all of these trends that I mentioned earlier work together and may create a perfect storm for the development model of countries. So you look at the successful development model of the last 50 years that so many countries in Asia have followed, which is cheap labor, export-led growth, and catch-up industrialization. The trends that I have been mentioning are threatening to make this development model obsolete. When it comes to cheap labor, the issue is digital automation, robots, algorithms, AI, which actually enable the old industrial countries to reshore some of the production lines into either their own markets or nearby, and actually undercut the comparative cost advantage of developing countries, because robots basically produce at the same cost as cheap labor. All the politicization, all the geopolitization of market access, of course, is a big worry. That means that export markets may freeze up, or they may be dependent on good political behavior. You, my friend, you come in. You're not my friend, you can go out. That's the reality of the world of tomorrow. And of course, if you weaponize technology transfer, and if you reconfigure global supply lines, there is a danger that some countries may actually be cut out of the global value chains, and that makes catch-up industrialization impossible. So there is opportunities, but there is also considerable risk.
Mark, if I could sort of also pick your brains on the fact, why are you, a bit optimistic about Pakistan being able to benefit from this, ongoing global dynamics and the shifts in it?
Well, it all depends if Pakistan is willing and able to adapt, and that goes for every country on the planet. It's not a specialty for Pakistan. I mean, this goes for my country, Germany. This goes for every country I know in Asia. There is an enormous need to quickly and speedily adapt the development models quite fundamentally, to basically implement some of the biggest paradigm shifts and structural reforms that we have seen over decades. And those countries who are able to do so, and do so in a clever way, also will be able to benefit from the new economy. And those who will not, and they will be lagging behind.
And so, Mark, I do understand, and I do know that, you don't claim yourself to be an authority on Pakistan. But from where you are, I'm sure, given that, over a decade of experience being placed in Asia itself, you have seen multiple economies thrive in that period. Could you sort of, elaborate? What is it that has really worked in terms of structural reforms for some of these countries versus initiatives that have actually failed? Could you actually, sort of distinguish the two in terms of what could actually work towards structural reforms?
Well, when we talk about structural reform, what that actually means is big ticket change, right? And big ticket change always creates winners and losers. That's just a fact of life. So basically what we need to understand as a starting point for this conversation is that those who benefit from the status quo, or believe to benefit from the status quo, will always resist big ticket change. And they are in quite a formidable position to do so, because the status quo alliance is actually at the very commandeering heights of the economy and the state. So basically, the ability to implement, to force through big ticket reform means that you need to be able to build a broad societal alliance that can actually mobilize the resources in order to struggle for this reform and make it happen against the resistance of the status quo alliance. So the whole difference between those countries that succeed and those that fail, those that succeed are able to build these big tent, broad, multi-class, multi-ethnic societal alliances. We're not talking about political parties in parliament. We're really talking about the very society itself. That is a formidable exercise, quite difficult to do, but to my knowledge, the only way how to do it.
Now, Mark, you've certainly spoken about on previous occasions about the credibility of multilateral institutions also. How do you think, the three big shocks that we've seen in the past few years and recently as well, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Israel-Palestine conflict, how do you see these three, or the troika of these crises, to have affected the credibility of the multilateral institutions? And if I may also ask, next year, we're likely to have, in 2024, US presidential election. How do you see that also affecting, the future of multilateral institutions also?
Well, the multilateral institutions are part and parcel of the competition over the world order. So they are, so to say, hostage of this very great power competition that's going on in all the fields: security, foreign policy, ideology, technology, economics. There is an enormous competition going on between the great powers. And that very competition also rages within the multilateral institutions, which are being contested basically by those who believe that they have, number one, not enough representation, that the multilateral architecture reflects the global balance of power of 1945, but does not reflect the global balance of power of the first of the 2020s and going forward. And basically, is part and parcel of the strategic competition with the US and China, which have very different ideas how a international order of tomorrow can look like. So it's not very surprising the multilateral institutions, most importantly United Nations, are not doing so well at the moment, because they're contested, and that's why they often seem to be paralyzed and cannot deliver what we want from them, to be a cooperation platform to tackle the global challenges that we all need to tackle. In that sense, your follow-up question is actually right on point, because I do believe that the presidential election of the United States is also quite a historical juncture. The two frontrunners right now, if the polls are to believe, which is the two presidents, Biden and Trump, have very different ideas about the role of the US in the international order and the very international order itself. We saw Trump in its first presidency basically exiting a lot of international treaties, a lot of international multilateral institutions, and basically trying to transform the United States into what he calls a normal nation state. So no longer a hegemon or world policeman that actually guarantees the rules of the road, depending where you stand on it, but actually a nation state that secures its own interest above all else. That's what America first means. And I think the contrast to President Biden is quite stark. Biden has been making a very point of returning into these treaties and multilateral institutions, has been making a point of strengthening the alliances of the US, has been making a point of talking about a rule-based international order. So that is a more traditional role of the US that we have seen over the last 70 years. So do understand that the perspective, let's say from Europe and the global South, of this role is very, very different, right? But nonetheless, it's for all of us the same juncture that we're looking at. And that basically means that it's going to be extremely consequential for the world order who wins that next election.
Mark, on this note, I'll have to admit that we'll have to conclude our conversation. And I really thank you for your time and for sharing your views with us.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation with Mr. Marc Saxer. Our team works very hard to make this work possible. And it would mean the world to us if you could like and share our content. And if you'd like to stay informed about our upcoming podcasts and other work, please hit the bell icon.